Steven Pinker. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Yascha.
I love your work. I have read many of your books and listened to some of your books, actually. In the new book, you suggest that a seemingly deceptively straightforward concept, that of common knowledge, actually holds the key to explaining all kinds of different social phenomena. And you take us on a really fun, wild ride, both in terms of the anecdotes you provide, the illustrations you provide, and in terms of the kind of domains of social life that you illustrate through the seemingly simple prism. So before we jump into some of those points and some of those examples, what do you mean by common knowledge? You mean something quite specific by that, right?
Yes, I'm using it in a technical sense, which is not the same as the everyday sense of conventional wisdom or something that people know. Common knowledge in the technical sense refers to a case where everyone knows that everyone knows something, and everyone knows that, and everyone knows that ad infinitum. So I know it, something, you know it, I know that you know it, you know that I know it, I know that you know that I know it, etc. Now that's, people start to smile when I explain the concept because
it sounds super complicated, but it's not that complicated.
It sounds so complicated, right? It sounds impossiable. Although tapping into a familiar feature of human nature is that we're always trying to get inside each other's heads. But the reason that first of all, the common knowledge is not impossible, the reason it doesn't make everyone's heads explode, is that you can get a sense of common knowledge at a stroke from the sense that something is conspicuous or self-evident or public or out there. That is, if you are witnessing something and you know that someone else, you witness someone else witnessing it and vice versa, that implicitly generates common knowledge at a stroke. It has everything you need, and you could reel out the I know that she knows that I know that she knows, should you ever have to, and sometimes we do. But the psychological manifestation is the sense that something is out there, including the metaphor out there and other metaphors like it was in his face, he pretended to ignore the elephant in the room. Cases where something is so conspicuous that you know that other people are seeing it at the same time that you are. So that's the idea. Why is it significant? And here I'm exposing readers to something that is well known in a number of sectors of academia, but mostly has not become, as we might say, common knowledge. And that is that common knowledge is necessary for coordination, for two people being on the same page, two or more people, and making choices that may be arbitrary, but that are very adaptive if everyone makes the same choice. The simplest example would be a rendezvous, where if I want to rendezvous meet with you at a certain place at a certain time, the easiest way to do it is cell phone call, which generates common knowledge. But in the absence of common knowledge, it's not enough for me to know that you like to go to Starbucks, because you might know that I like to go to Pete's, and so you might not go to Starbucks that day, but go to Pete's in anticipation of meeting me. But then I might go to Starbucks in anticipation of meeting you, and then I might second guess you and say, oh, well, Yascha knows I like Pete's, so he's going to go to Pete's after all, but Yascha's going to think, oh, well, Steve knows I like Starbucks, so he's going to go to Starbucks. Nothing short.
It becomes a guessing game where you just can't accurately predict the other's behavior, in part because they might be trying to predict your behavior.
Exactly. So nothing short of knowing that the other person knows that you know guarantees you'll end up at the same place at the same time. That's a simple example. But there are a lot of examples that just make large-scale social coordination possible, such as driving on the left or driving on the right. It doesn't matter which side you drive on. It matters a lot that everyone drives on the same side, and moreover that everyone knows that everyone drives on the same side and knows which side that is. Or
because you drive at a certain kind of speed, assuming you don't suddenly have a car coming the other way. And unless I knew that everybody knows that we're supposed to drive on the right or on the left, if you're in Britain or India or wherever, even if I was going to drive on the right, and even if I could observe that a lot of people drive on the right, I'd have to drive with extreme caution, because I would think perhaps somebody isn't in on this fact, and they might suddenly drive on the left side, and then we're going to be heading for an imminent clash.
Indeed, and in fact, in 1969, Sweden decided to switch from driving on the left to driving on the right to harmonize with the rest of continental Europe, and that was a big problem. And so there was a a lot of anticipation and announcement, and the switchover took place at a stroke on, I believe it was midnight December 31st. So it was a day that popped out in the calendar that everyone knew about, everyone could remember, everyone could count on everyone else remembering, and that's what made it work. And very often, problems in common knowledge are solved in or problems in coordination, I should say, where there actually isn't literal common knowledge, where there's a focal point, something that pops out. It's sometimes called a Schelling point in honor of Thomas Schelling, who first gave the parable of a couple who was separated in New York, kind of like the rendezvous problem I started out with. And he tried to imagine how would they find each other. And this was years before cell phones would be even invented. And he suspected that they might each choose to rendezvous at the clock in Grand Central Station at noon, even if it hadn't been particularly close to where they had been separated, simply because each one could reasonably guess that it would pop into the mind of the other, and more important, that the other would know that it would pop into their mind. These are sometimes called Schelling points in his honor, things that are so salient, so self-evident that one can alight on them as a focal point for coordination.
That's interesting because if I thought of a Schelling point in New York, there's a bunch of different ones that could come to your mind. Times Square would be another obvious alternative. Perhaps the Statue of Liberty, for that's 2 hours of the way, so you might think we're not going to go there. In some European towns, you might have a more obvious Schelling points. I mean, in Munich, the town where I grew up, you would definitely go to Marienplatz, which is the central square, and there's a central clock, and it's sort of obvious which one it is. American cities are built in such a way that it might be less obvious. I want to go back a couple of steps. I think this is a great preview of the terrain you cover, and now I want to sort of retread it a little bit more slowly. So to go back to this idea of common knowledge, in everyday speech, we might say that the fact that Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet is a piece of common knowledge. An educated citizen should know that. Most people, even today in the United States, probably know that fact. That's not what you're talking about.
It is not what I meant. And I think a better term would have been mutual knowledge, and that's what I called it in an earlier book, The Stuff of Thought. But I came to appreciate that among the experts in the academic fields that discuss it, common knowledge has just become the conventional term, which, by the way, itself is an example of common knowledge. The reason that linguists are interested in common knowledge is that that's how language works. Every word is a convention. It's arbitrary. A rose by any other name would smell as sweet, but we can use the sound rose to convey the idea of a rose, simply because all of us know that the rest of us know that that's the way we do it in English, and in another language it would be a different word. And common knowledge, even though it's somewhat misleading, we're kind of stuck with it. It got grandfathered in. Words get grandfathered in, and when kids learn a word, they might hear it from a parent, from a sibling, from a friend, but they instantly know that they can use it with any other English speaker and they'll be understood. So a word is a quintessential convention, and a convention works by common knowledge.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating point. I believe you make the point in your book on language that if you, I may be misremembering this example, if you make up a word and use it in front of a child, they will assume that this is just a normal word in the language, and they're then going to use it with other people who won't in fact know or understand that word because they have that assumption. Okay, so let's go to this second kind of thing, right? Emperor's New Clothes. At the beginning of that story, you have a situation in which everybody knows the same thing. Everybody knows that the emperor is not wearing any clothes. They look at the emperor, they can see that he's naked, they can see his genitals, they can see whatever, right? And yet you would argue that's not common knowledge. There's this crucial distinction between everybody knows and everybody knows that everybody knows. What is that distinction, and why is that so important? Why does it make such a difference whether everybody knows or whether everybody also knows that everybody else knows?
Yes, and when the child blurts out the emperor is naked, he wasn't telling anyone anything they didn't already know, but he changed the state of their knowledge because now everyone knew that everyone else knew, and everyone else knew that. Now in the story, or at least in the Danny Kaye version of the story, which most people are familiar with, that changed their social relationship with the emperor from obsequious deference to ridicule and scorn. So the extra idea in when everyone knows that everyone knows, we haven't gotten to yet, is that I argue that social relationships are coordination games. Whether you defer to someone, whether you are intimate friends, whether you're lovers, whether you're transaction partners, all of those are matters of common knowledge. What makes two people friends? It's not as if they sign a contract, but each one knows that the other one knows that they're friends, and each one knows that, etc. And often challenges to status, in the case of the emperor's new clothes, the dignity and status of the king, the emperor, are matters of common knowledge. Questions of deference and authority and esteem. And the reason being, the reason from game theory is that very often when there's a competitive encounter between two agents, they both might want a resource. Will they fight over it? Well, not necessarily, because it could be in each of their interests for one to defer to the other and claim the resource if the cost of fighting is worth more than the resource itself. The dilemma being, of course, each one would rather be the one that is the alpha, is the one with the authority that the other one defers to. But once they get locked into it, the subordinate defers to the dominant because he knows the dominant will stand his ground, and the dominant stands his ground because he knows the subordinate will give way, and the subordinate gives way because the dominant knows that he'll give way because both of them know the dominant will stand his ground, and so on. And so that's why so much of social life consists of little games in which we save face or lose face, why we have pissing contests, why when it can actually come to, people can come to blows when what the one who's always on the short end of the stick decides to challenge the dominant one, and why so many homicides are over what police classify as trivial altercations: road rage, fighting over who gets to use a pool table, jostling, curse, looking someone in the eye, and it literally can lead to homicide. And one might say that on the international stage, it literally leads to war. That many wars, most obviously Russia and Ukraine, are really over nothing except esteem, standing, face, rectifying, humiliation, wreaking revenge. It matters, even though these are trivial altercations in one sense, because they could decide going forward who defers to whom in an unending set of confrontations in the future.
So there's obviously different game theory games that are famous and canonical, and you go through some of them and try to explain how the idea of common knowledge might help us to interpret them. It seems to me that in some of the examples you just mentioned, the most important game theoretical game is probably that of chicken. And the game of chicken is basically, there's different ways of putting it, but one of them is that I think in the famous movie Rebel Without a Cause, I think there's a scene of chicken. Two people get into cars and they drive towards the abyss, and the question is, who's going to jump out first? And if you're the one who jumps out first, then you lose face. But if neither of the people are willing to jump out early enough, then one or both of them may end up driving over the cliff and losing their life. And what you point out is that in certain contexts, you really don't want to have a reputation for standing down, because how close to the cliff I'm willing to drive is going to depend on my assessment of you. If I think that you're a horrible coward who's definitely sure well before the cliff to jump out, then I'm going to say, well, I'm definitely going to keep driving because I know that my rival is eventually going to jump out, and then I can stop the car. If I think you're a crazy son of a bitch, you're going to do whatever it takes to win this, then I might be much more scared, and I might be willing to jump out of the way much quicker. And so I take it that you're sort of applying that to something like an inner city game of chicken, where you might have, somebody, did you look at me weird? Do you have a problem with me? What's going on, right? And the rational thing to do is to stand down. Oh, no, I wasn't looking at you, never mind me, keep your head down and so on. But what you're doing by that is to signal that you're subject to intimidation. that you can be messed
exactly
with.
right.
And if you acquire a reputation that you can be messed with, then other people are going to be much more willing to play games of chicken with you because they know you're the one who's going to back down. And so you can't afford to acquire that reputation. And so you might end up in a dangerous, perhaps a deadly altercation over these really trivial things because that reputation matters so much. And that's to do with common knowledge. Why? Because you can't create the common knowledge that you're willing to back down.
It's because in the game of chicken, which is the same mathematically as what evolutionary biologists sometimes call the hawk-dove game, where you've got two animals that compete over a resource. The worst outcome is if they fight. They could both die, even though the winner could sustain a fatal wound. The best is if they split the resource or they resolve it by some convention, like whoever arrived first claims it and the other one leaves, sometimes called the bourgeois strategy, and quite literally could be the basis of property rights, where it's in many legal systems, possession is 9/10 of the law. Whoever currently squats on or has possession of the resource is the presumptive owner of it, not because of any cosmic desert, but simply because it avoids endless squabbling and it's a stable outcome. But yes, in chicken or hawk-dove, where common knowledge comes in is that a stable relationship of one deferring to the other can settle in if avoiding the fight is a better outcome than both sides fighting over it, where being the loser kind of sucks, but it's better than being killed in a fight. Now, the problem is if you settle into a relationship where one dominates the other, always gets his way, and that can be sometimes decided by fairly arbitrary conventions in the animal kingdom. It's why animals have ruffs and roars, and they bellow and they rear and they strut. All these rituals, which have fascinated ethologists for decades, and now are really understood to be equilibria in a hawk-dove confrontation. That is a case where it's better for one to defer to the other than both to fight. Now what happens is, of course, animals sometimes do fight to the death, and armies sometimes do meet each other on the battlefield. Sometimes when neither of them is willing to concede second place, or when fighting is the only way to determine who would prevail in a conflict. If the outcome is a foregone conclusion, then the rational thing for both parties to do is for the weaker to defer to the stronger without a fight. Now, what happens to the beta or the gamma or the sigma, who's always gets the short end of the stick? He could challenge the alpha, risky, but if he has reason to believe that he would prevail, he could try to turn the tables, or he could just exit that relationship and choose a different partner to interact with, if that is an option. But just zooming out a bit, going back to common knowledge, it's an example of a game that has multiple equilibria, which is to say that there's more than one state in which neither has an incentive to switch. They're kind of locked into it because any option is worse if the other guy doesn't switch, and that's true for both of them. So hawk-dove is an example. Another example is what's in goes back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It's called a stag hunt, where imagine two hunters. They can work together if they show up with heavy weaponry to fell a big meaty stag. Although there is some risk that if one of them shows up with the big bow and arrow and the other one just comes with a slingshot, then the guy with the bow and arrow won't be able to fell the stag on his own. Now, if each one fears that, both of them might show up with slingshots and they end up with nothing but puny rabbits. But it's
and the idea here is that if both cooperate, it's really positive for both.
Exactly.
If one defects and it doesn't help with the big arrow, the presumption is it takes two people to kill the stag. One person has no chance of killing the stag on their own, so that person is going to go hungry. Whereas the person who defects to just going after the smaller animal is very likely to get that and at least have some kind of dinner. Is that the background idea here?
Exactly, and it's not a prisoner's dilemma in the sense that there's no question of betrayal, selfishness, loyalty. It's really a question of assurance, of trust, of confidence, that if each one fears that the other one may show up with a slingshot, if only out of fear that they will show up with a slingshot, because it's the safe but less lucrative option, then both of them, in the absence of common knowledge solves the problem. If they can have a phone call, it's like, let's hunt stag, great, they all win. In the absence of a phone call, each one guessing what the other one will bring, they will naturally slide to the second best, which is also the second worst alternative of each settling.
And I'm going to advocate here for listeners who may not be as much up on game theory. So the crucial difference between this and the prisoner's dilemma is that in the stag hunt, both have an interest in cooperating. As long as they're somehow able to both cooperate, the outcome is better for both, right? The best outcome of all the different outcomes between I cooperate and you cooperate, or I cooperate and you don't cooperate, or you cooperate and I don't cooperate, or neither of us cooperate. The best outcome is we both cooperate. So we both have an interest in getting there. So as long as we have common knowledge, as long as we have that phone call that, are you definitely bringing your weaponry and I'm definitely bringing my weaponry, let's go do it. I know that unless you're just an idiot or forgetful or get distracted, you're going to show up with your weaponry because you have no interest in going for the smaller animal. As long as we're both there and we're both going after the stag.
So the question of it is a quintessential case of common knowledge in the sense that
right.
It is not a question of loyalty or principle or afraid of being cheated. It's just you worry that the other guy may not cooperate because he's worried that you might, and so on. There are analogies.
And the prisoner's dilemma, I believe, is different, right? If they both cooperate, then they get 2 years in prison or something like that, right? They get a lesser punishment. Yes, that's a key point because they can indict them on some lesser crime or whatever it is. But if I cooperate and you don't cooperate, you go to the state and you snitch on me, then I might get 10 years and you're going to get off for free completely, and vice versa. And so in that case, even if we have common knowledge, even if we ring each other and say, hey, you're not going to talk to them, right? And I'm not going to talk to them. All right, I promise. The problem is that in any scenario, I still have an advantage in not cooperating. Whether you cooperate or whether you don't cooperate,
yes.
If I defect from you, my relative outcome is better. And because there's common knowledge about that, because I know that you have an interest in defecting, and you know that I have an interest in defecting, the most likely outcome is that we both defect, even though that's suboptimal relative to what we both could have achieved by cooperating. Now, what does common knowledge tell us about how to analyze a prisoner's dilemma? And I think a lot of people listening to this are most familiar with prisoner's dilemma. I think the other game theory variations are much less commonly discussed, especially in a broader public. So help us say a little bit about sort of the centrality of a prisoner's dilemma to how we think about those things, and why that's definitely what some situations are like, but why we also need to recognize that in other situations, the prisoner's dilemma really doesn't apply, and you might, I think, get an overly negative view of a social world if you assume that everything is prisoner's dilemmas always all the way down.
Yes, that's right. So in a prisoner's dilemma, the best thing that could happen to you is if you defect and the other guy cooperates. Then he gets the worst outcome, you get the best outcome. In a stag hunt, the best outcome is if you both cooperate, because then you both come home with lots of venison. And in a prisoner's dilemma, the tragic aspect of it, and a prisoner's dilemma is the same as what's sometimes called the tragedy of the commons, which is that the only equilibrium, that is the only state that if you're in it, no one has an incentive to get out, is both defect. So the tragedy in a prisoner's dilemma is each one rats out the other. They both go away for 5 years, whereas if only they could have stayed mum, they would have got only sort of 6 months. But there's no rational way that they could get out of it. And crucially, in a prisoner's, so there's one equilibrium. It's a tragic equilibrium, and communication doesn't help. It's what game theorists call cheap talk. If one of them says, "Hey, I'll stay loyal if you will," why should the other guy trust you, given that it's still going to be in your interest to defect regardless of what he does? And each one goes through that same soliloquy in their head. They both defect. They end up with the second worst outcome for the two of them. In a stag hunt, communication is actually self-reinforcing. If I say I'm going to show up tomorrow with a big bow and arrow, there's no reason for me to defect if it generates common knowledge. If I know that the other person hears it and can acknowledge it, then we both win. But there are two equilibria in a stag hunt, so that's with common knowledge. If you both cooperate, that is, if you both bring bows and arrows, you both win. And given that the other guy is bringing a bow and arrow, that's what you should do too. On the other hand, if the other guy brings a slingshot, then you should bring a slingshot. And if both of you bring slingshots, you're stuck in that equilibrium. And in general, here's just a generalization about coordination, common knowledge, and game theory, that whenever you have a game with two equilibria, two situations in which both of them make choices and neither one has an incentive to switch given the other guy's choice, then it's a question of, well, which of the two equilibria are they going to find themselves in? And that's where Schelling pointed out 60 years ago, arbitrary symbols, caprice, whimsy, historical accidents, all of those can be quite decisive because they're ways of the two people getting into one or the other equilibrium. As in the couple that meets in Grand Central Station, there's no reason they should meet there. There's no way to predict that they would meet there other than the fact that it pops out as a solution makes it a solution.
I have a point about how this is relevant to politics and a question about how that is relevant.
Yes, and let's go
politics.
through a couple of examples because it's highly relevant to politics.
Yeah. So one example of a Schelling point in politics, it seems to me, is the strange politics of elections and dictatorships. So the first point is, why is it that dictators are so intent on holding elections when it's pretty obvious that they're fraudulent, when they're disqualifying the most promising other political parties, when they already control the entire political system? They nevertheless hold elections in many countries. I would guess that a majority of dictatorships in the world hold elections, which is quite a strange, remarkable thing, really. And why is that? Well, I think perhaps one answer that I'm medium confident about, not super confident about, but I think is plausible, is that if they stop holding elections, that is a really clear indication that they're no longer a democracy. Until then, countries that are allied with this country for geopolitical interest, people within the state who want to have an interest in pretending that they're legitimate, can claim that we're still a democracy. Oh, you claim that this democracy is fraudulent. It wasn't really, even if everybody kind of knows it's bullshit, some people can pretend that they don't know it's bullshit. The moment the election is cancelled, and it used to be that every 4 years there's an election, now suddenly there hasn't been an election for 5 or 6 years, people can't pretend anymore. And so that may be one of the explanations why people continue to hold elections. Now, the additional point I have...
That would happen particularly if there was an announcement that elections were cancelled, where everyone could coordinate, because then it was everyone knew that everyone else knew that that they were living in a dictatorship. And certainly regime change and regimes holding power operate by common knowledge phenomena. This is an observation I owe to Michael Chue, who wrote about 25 years ago a book with a similar theme to mine called Rational Ritual, where he talked about the role of common knowledge in public life. But he gave the example of a public demonstration. Why do dictators dread the idea of a public gathering? And why is, conversely, is freedom of association enshrined in democratic constitutions? Well, if each individual in a dictatorship may know that the dictatorship is inefficient and corrupt and cruel, but and they may even suspect that everyone else believes it, but they can't be sure that everyone else knows that everyone else believes it. And without the safety in numbers, they might fear that any one of them standing up could be picked off by the dictator's goons. If everyone stood up at once, then there's no regime on earth that could cling to power. I quote the Gandhi character in the movie of that name, where he tells a British officer, in the end you will leave, because it is simply impossible for 100,000 Englishmen to control 350 million Indians if the Indians refuse to cooperate. So that's a basic fact of arithmetic. He could have chose to coordinate. And so dictators, to cling to power, have to ensure that the people don't coordinate, that even if every one of them hates the regime, they can't rise up at the same time to storm the palace or to have a work stoppage. And so they try to prevent freedom of speech, freedom of the press that would generate that coordination. So I recount a joke from the old Soviet Union in which a man is handing out leaflets in Red Square, and sure enough, the KGB arrest him. They take him back to headquarters, and only to discover that the leaflets are blank sheets of paper. So they confront him and they say, "What is the meaning of this?" And he says, "What's there to say? It's so obvious." Now, the point of the joke is he was generating subversive common knowledge, that by accepting the pieces of paper, now everyone knew that everyone else knew, by the very fact that he was distributing the paper, that there was a reason to resent the regime, which the authorities wanted to stop. And in a case of life imitating a joke, Putin's police force have arrested protesters for carrying a blank sign, because the blank sign is subversive even with no content. It generates common knowledge.
Yeah, I kept thinking as I was reading your book, and particularly the more political examples, of one of my favorite essays, The Power of the Powerless by Václav Havel. In that essay, I think he grapples, without using that terminology or perhaps quite having that frame, with the power of common knowledge in two ways. The first is that he describes that if you're a greengrocer, you need to put in your store some slogan like "Workers of the World Unite." Even for that's meaningless. It's an empty political slogan. Everybody kind of knows that it's an empty political slogan. But if you refused to put that sign in your store, you would somehow mark yourself out as subversive. And I wonder whether this is meant to do two kinds of things. First, I think it is meant to produce common knowledge about the fact that everybody is choosing to comply with a regime. But even if people know that you're in some ways coerced to do this, the fact that you look around and you see all of these signs gives you the common knowledge that all of my fellow citizens are in fact choosing to obey the diktat of this regime, which I may not like, which I may suspect is unpopular, but there's this daily visible common knowledge that all the other citizens are choosing to obey it, so perhaps I better do as well. And this is why, secondly, Havel argues that ordinary citizens have this tremendous power in a totalitarian regime like that, because your act of refusal to put the sign in your store can take on this incredible political power. But even though it seems rather innocuous to not put that sign in your store, it can start if many people choose not to comply with the small, not that important daily demands of a regime. That can perhaps be the beginning of a source of common knowledge. But I'm not the only person who feels that way. I'm not the only one who wants to resist these kinds of instructions. My fellow citizens actually have the same thoughts that I suspected previously that they have.
I mean, it works best if everyone does it at the same time, if somehow they know what day it is that everyone takes down the sign. Again, which is why freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly are repressed in dictatorships, which is less obvious than you would think, because you might think, well, a dictator can just let the people bitch and moan all they want. He's got the guns, he's got the power. And the reason that they don't is that there is safety in numbers, but only if there is coordination, if everyone resists at the same time, so they overpower the regime, which they can only do with common knowledge. By the way, a case of a public protest like that is a stag hunt, where it's in everyone's interest if everyone acts together. That is, if they, the equivalent of hunting stag is opposing the regime. but being the only one who opposes the regime is the equivalent of showing up with heavy weaponry.
That takes us back, by the way, to the last point I was going to make a few minutes ago about the politics of elections and dictatorships, which is that on the one hand, you don't want to announce that you're canceling elections because that creates a shelling point. That creates a moment for people who are unhappy to say, well, we just found out there's not going to be an election. Let's go out and protest that. But on the other hand, of course, if you do hold an election, even if everybody in advance knows that it's fake, even if everybody expects the results to be fraudulent, the moment the official results are announced and the dictator gets, depending on their ambition, 55 or 85 or 99% of the vote, that is also a natural coordination point for people to come out and say this election was stolen. And so you can see this sort of managing of common knowledge and managing of trying to avoid creating these shelling points as a key part of this kind of politics of dictatorship.
Indeed. And you get shelling points often with decisive historic roles, sometimes when there is what I call communal outrage. And again, this goes back to shelling, where if there is an attack on a individual commonly known, that is, gets publicity, and that person, the victims symbolize an entire group, then that often galvanizes the entire group. It can serve as a shelling point for them to engage in massive aggression against what they perceive as the aggressor group, because the event is the shelling point, is the common knowledge generator that allows them to coordinate their resistance. So examples are the 9/11, Pearl Harbor, the Maine, the Lusitania, George Floyd, the Tunisian fruit peddler who immolated himself when he was harassed by the Tunisian authorities. Cases where there seems to be a disproportionate response, but it's as if the assault on one of us, because it is common knowledge, that is, everyone knows that it happened, if we accept it, we are accepting second-class beta subordinate status going forward. We have to challenge it also in highly public forums to regain or claim dominant status.
What does all of that make you think about the madman theory of international relations? So there's a famous theory where, the simple version of which is to say, it can be a big advantage in international relations if people think you're a little bit nuts. Because going back to the game of chicken, if people think that this guy is so nuts, he really is willing to go, to nuclear war over Cuba or over this or over that, then the other side is going to stand down because they don't want mutually assured destruction. Now, I think an interesting feature of this that I hadn't quite thought through until reflecting on it in the light of the idea of common knowledge is that, of course, here you need the common knowledge that you're nuts for this to work, right? It's me knowing that the foreign leader knows that I'm nuts that means that this is going to work. And the ideal circumstance is one in which you're actually behaving very rationally, but the other leader thinks you're nuts. Now, the worst case scenario is that the other leader thinks that you're behaving rationally, but you're actually nuts. So there's a kind of subtlety to the madman theory of international relations that I hadn't quite appreciated before thinking about it in this context of common knowledge.
Yes, and again, Thomas Schelling deserves credit for the concept. He called it a paradoxical tactic, and it applies to a game of chicken, or equivalently a hawk-dove game. So in the case of chicken, imagine the two teenagers approaching each other at high speed on a narrow road. Let's say one of them locks a steering wheel, puts a cinder block on the accelerator, conspicuously, and puts his hands up. That's a crazy thing to do, but he's going to win the game of chicken. Unless, and of course, as you say, it has to be common knowledge. If you were to do it in a way that the other guy could see, it defeats the whole purpose. Now, there are two dangers. One of them is, of course, if both of them play madman at the same time, then there will be a crash. That's, by the way, part of the conceit of the movie Dr. Strangelove, where in fact the Soviets actually play the madman strategy, but keep it a secret for 2 days, and it's during those 2 days that the plot is set in motion that will lead to the end of the world. And it has been speculated that at various times Richard Nixon, Donald Trump, Kim Jong-un played the madman strategy, did something that is patently against their own interests, because then they can't be reasoned with. That is, you can't, if someone is a madman, you can't make them an offer they can't refuse. They can refuse it, that means that they kind of win in the confrontation. The other solution to, if someone plays a madman is, I mean, if that is an option, is you don't deal with them anymore, you partner with someone else. And of course, they're everyday life equivalents. Many of us have been in friendships or relationships with someone who is stubborn, irrational, can't be reasoned with, but they get their way because you can't reason with them, and so they always win. The risk that they're playing is, divorce or the equivalent. You break off the relationship if that's the way, that if the other party is always going to play madman.
That's a very interesting point. Yeah, sadly in international relations, when you have two nuclear powers threatening each other, there's no option of just disengaging in the same way, but in the private realm, the rational solution when somebody is playing a game of chicken with you or playing a game of madman with you is simply to say, I'm going to go spend my time with other people. Bringing it back more broadly, I've really enjoyed our excursus into high politics and international relations, but bringing it back to the realm of the social world, once we understand the importance of common knowledge and the way that it manifests in different parts of the social world, we also gain a renewed appreciation of the different kind of ways in which we have habits, rituals, behaviors to manage common knowledge. So obviously, a wedding ceremony is a form of common knowledge. It's a form of creating and celebrating a common commitment, which is not only meant to show, like a wedding ring is, that somebody is not available, that they're not on the market, as it were, but also to make it costly, to not invest in the relationship in certain ways afterwards. It's more embarrassing to break up with somebody after you've celebrated a big wedding than it is if you've just been boyfriend and girlfriend for a while. And so that is one kind of way of managing, creating common knowledge with the goal of strengthening human relationship. In other circumstances, we may have rituals that are supposed to do the opposite, the weasel words and other things that are supposed to make it easier for us to pretend that we don't all know something, to demarcate the line between we all know this, but we've carefully avoided creating common knowledge that might then require us to act on it. Talk to us a little bit about what these different ways of managing the phenomenon of common knowledge in our social world entail.
Yes, indeed. So a lot of rituals, coming of age ceremonies, investitures, coronations, inaugurations, weddings, are things that happen in public. That is, you witness the event at the same time as you witness everyone else witnessing the event, and that generates the common knowledge that establishes a new equilibrium. In the case of, say, an investiture, a coming of age, a bar mitzvah, now everyone, you don't have to constantly be in doubt. Is this person worthy of the privileges of adulthood? I mean, how can you really know? There's not one day that you wake up an adult, but the whole society tacitly agrees to treat that person as an adult, or that person as unavailable, or that person as having authority, and so on. And we have these rituals in our everyday relationships. Friends, for example, will often a friendship will start when you break bread together, or experience go to a ball game together, where there's some event that both of you. Each one knows the other one knows that they're engaging in, and that can inaugurate a new relationship. In the case of a romantic relationship, it is often the verbal formula, I love you, I love you. And so I cite an episode of Seinfeld, which George has been dating a woman for a while, and he tells Jerry and Elaine, tonight I'm going to make a big move. I'm going to tell her that I love her. And Jerry says, ooh, Georgie, that's a big move, because if you say I love you and you don't get that I love you return, that's a big matzo ball hanging out there. Now, a big matzo ball is a great metaphor for common knowledge. Namely, it is a conspicuous object that each one can see, and the other one sees them seeing it, and it therefore changes the nature of the relationship. And indeed, the converse, when people will avoid some salient public event, helps explain all of the bits of hypocrisy and genteel politeness and euphemism and innuendo and tact and savoir-faire that mark a lot of our relationships. And that's how I got into this whole area, from my interest in language. Because it's been known for linguists for decades that in actual communication, people don't actually literally mean what they say a lot of the time. One of the reasons it took so long to get computers to understand natural language is that if you just program them with rules, the subject and the verb and the object and the subject is the actor and all of that, it often doesn't work because people mean something very different. If you could pass the salt, that would be awesome, as an example. That doesn't mean if you could pass the salt, that would be awesome. What it means is, give me the salt. Or veiled bribes. Let's say you want to jump the queue in a fancy restaurant where you have no reservation and you slip the maitre d' a $50 bill. People in those circumstances don't say, would you seat me for $50? They say things like, I was wondering if you might have a cancellation, or is there any way to shorten my wait? And of course, sexual come-ons are a rich area for indirectness and euphemism. Do you want to come up and see my etchings? Do you want to come up for coffee? Do you want to come up for Netflix and chill? So why do we do that? And observers of the human drama, including writers of comedies of manners and situation comedies, play off the fact that we don't blurt out what we mean. We do this, you might call it a ritual. And so for me, the question is why? And common knowledge, I think, is the best answer. Namely, if he says, do you want to come up for coffee? And she says no. You know, she's a grown woman. She knows that coffee doesn't mean coffee. So it's not plausible deniability. She could not plausibly deny it, but still, there's a bit of doubt in that she doesn't know that he knows that she knows. She could still think, well, maybe he thinks I'm naive. And he could think, well, maybe she thinks I'm dense. You know, I know she's turned down a sexual come-on, but does she know that I know that she knows? Without the common knowledge, I suggested, they can maintain the fiction of a purely platonic relationship, since relationships depend on common knowledge. So direct speech, blunt speech, blurting it out generates common knowledge. Innuendo, hints, euphemism, beating around the bush, hoping the other person will catch your drift, connect the dots, generates knowledge but not common knowledge. And that's what people use when they don't want to upend a current social relationship. In the case of a maitre d', it's that it's not a transactional arrangement. The maitre d' has authority over his restaurant domain. You're challenging that by offering a quid pro quo. By keeping it out of common knowledge, he maintains his social relationship as the person in charge, but you can still transact the exchange.
So what's interesting about this is that at the beginning of a conversation, I think it would have been tempting to think that having more common knowledge is nearly always a good thing. In the example about emperor's new clothes and in some of those other examples, you know, we all privately know this important fact that the emperor is actually a little bit out of his mind. You know, but we can't act on it. And when finally the child blurts out he's naked, and we are able to treat him as he deserves to be treated in some way, with ridicule and so on. In the example of a dictatorship, that's an even more extreme example of that. We all privately hate the regime, but we are scared to be punished, in part because we don't know how many of our fellow citizens feel the same way. But once we've managed to create the common knowledge that we all hate the regime, we might have a chance to actually overturn this regime. So in those cases, creating common knowledge is a good thing. What's interesting about some of these more recent examples is that they speak to circumstances in which creating common knowledge might be a bad thing. Early in a relationship, there may be a moment of asynchronicity where, you know, I've already fallen in love, but my partner has not yet fallen in love. Perhaps they never will, but perhaps they will. Perhaps in 2 months they would. And if I, as the example of George indicates, am too fast in jumping to express that, then we suddenly have this really awkward thing where I've said it and the other person hasn't said it, and that might make it really hard to get to the place where we feel in a mutual way. So avoiding that piece of common knowledge may be a really important thing to sustaining the deepening of relationship. I mean, another example I thought is, if you have to deal with somebody elderly who perhaps has some, embarrassing bodily misfunctions, perhaps they fart really loudly, or they have body odor, or there's some other thing. It might be really embarrassing if there's a child that blurts out, "Grandpa, why do you stink?" Right? It makes the situation way worse for everybody. Much better for everybody to sort of politely pretend that they can't, that they're not aware of the fact that Grandpa doesn't have full control over his own body anymore. So how should we think about this systematically? I mean, radical honesty would be bad, radical hypocrisy would be bad. How do we negotiate the in-between place where we can have helpful social norms about when to turn knowledge that everybody has into common knowledge and when to avoid turning knowledge that everybody has into common knowledge?
Yes, so there's no general guideline because it depends on the costs and benefits in that circumstance. And there are many cases. I mean, you talked about the embarrassing elderly person. Well, we all went through that a bit more than a year ago when everyone knew that Joe Biden was suffering cognitive decline. No one was sure that everyone else knew it, including among his advisors, until he had that disastrous debate with Donald Trump, in which the cognitive decline became evident. The crucial thing about that debate is that everyone was watching it and everyone knew that everyone was watching it. It was a nationally televised debate that got a lot of publicity, and that's what marked the beginning of the end of his presidential run. Or another example where hypocrisy can be rational. Again, this is in the news, something that I tweeted about just yesterday. It's the case of Taiwan, where Taiwan is de facto a sovereign state. They control their borders, they have a government, but the official policy of the United States is that it doesn't exist, that it is controlled by the People's Republic of China, which is, of course, not true, at least not yet. Why doesn't the United States recognize reality and extend official recognition to Taiwan? That is, why do they engage in this hypocrisy? And it is rational in the sense that recognizing Taiwan would be seen as an affront to the People's Republic of China, which has staked its reputation on controlling all of historic China. And so it would be a challenge to its face, its dominance, its supremacy, its esteem, its standing that they would not tolerate. And then it's like having the two birds fighting over territory actually come to blows instead of one ceding it to the other. So it's quite rational for to have that degree of hypocrisy. Another example that I give is Israel's policy about nuclear weapons, where it will neither confirm nor deny that it has nuclear weapons. Now, clearly, if the only reason to have nuclear weapons is, as in a game of chicken, it has to be known for it to be effective as a deterrent. On the other hand, if they were to publicly declare that they were a nuclear state, then that would force their Arab rivals to acquire their own nuclear weapons so as not to lose face. And therefore, they've decided the optimal situation is what they call strategic ambiguity. That is, there is knowledge, but there could still be some doubt as to whether the other one really knows that you know that they know, etc. And that's what makes it sustainable.
That's an interesting thing about the phrase "I cannot confirm or deny." Now, sometimes that has to do with, politicians or institutions that have a policy not to confirm or deny particular things. But often, when you use it in a social sense, it is a kind of winking way to say yes to something, right? Do you hate your boss? Or I can neither confirm nor deny that. Well, that's a way of politely saying, yes, of course I do, in such a way that you can't be quoted and fired by your boss if if they somehow find out, right? So it's an interesting
A lot
kind
of
of piece of management of common knowledge in general. I have a slightly different question I wanted to get to, which is whether there are systematic differences between cultures in how they manage common knowledge. It seems to me, for example, that some cultures are much more direct than others. German culture, which I grew up in, I think is very direct culture. I think Chinese culture, actually, this is something that Westerners often are mistaken about, is a very direct culture. It's quite standard for relatives in China to greet each other, and particularly to greet female relatives with "你胖了吗?" Right? Did you put on weight? Which is something much more direct than what most polite Americans would say, even within a family. And then there's much more high-touch indirect cultures that try to avoid speaking about things in similarly direct ways. Is it helpful to think about that cultural difference as a difference in sort of a set of strategies about how to manage common knowledge? And how should we think about, are these just different sets of choices and they're both equally good? Are there things in our culture where you think we should change how we deal with common knowledge, where perhaps we can take a leaf out of more direct cultures? Or do you think that there's some things that more direct cultures get wrong in ways that perhaps make life there a little bit harder and they could stand to learn from more indirect cultures? Or am I sort of mismapping the relationship between cultural directness and these ideas of common knowledge?
Yes, no, there are clearly cultural differences, and it's sometimes said that Japan, for example, is highly indirect, that Arab cultures are highly indirect, that businessmen complain that they can just never sit down and cut the deal because there's so many layers of honorifics. And it is known that levels of directness and versus politeness can vary. Probably no culture lacks some degree of politeness or hypocrisy altogether, but they do major dimensions of cultural variation are first of all just a linear scale of how blunt versus how indirect and euphemistic you are, how much honorific bowing there is. But also it can be context specific, so that it can be within a family, within a store, teacher student, boss employee, friends. Which resource, that is, are you talking about meals, sex, money, favors, context in the home, out of the home, and cultural differences can often hinge on what kind of relationship. Is it a kind of communal sharing where we all pretend to be friends, authority, one person gets their way and the other defers, equity or equality or reciprocity, where you take turns or trade favors, and the combination of which of those three relational models, what kind of dyad, parent-child, salesperson, customer, husband-wife, and what context, home, workplace. That combinatorics I think accounts for a lot of the differences in cultures, including what you can blurt out that generates common knowledge or otherwise signaled by some ritual, and what gets submerged.
We've been talking a little bit as though you either have private knowledge or you have shared knowledge that is not common knowledge. Or once a knowledge becomes common, we've sort of assumed the national scale to it. Now, obviously, it could be that something becomes common knowledge within a particular community or a particular subset of a nation. And I increasingly worry about polarization in the United States. And perhaps one way of thinking about polarization is in terms of different, perhaps competing sets of common knowledge. In the wake of the horrible shooting of Charlie Kirk, it became common knowledge on the right that the shooter had a left-leaning political ideology. But if you read, a lot of social media posts on the left, a lot of blue sky posts, some posts on Twitter, or Substack posts by people like Havercox Richardson, it's common knowledge in progressive circles that actually the shooter was a far-right part of a Groyper army and not a left-winger at all. And so you've ended up with these very different pieces of common knowledge. Is that a way of thinking about common knowledge, that you can have sort of one half of a country believe that they have one kind of common knowledge and the other half of a country believe that they have a different kind of common knowledge? Or unless you have universal agreement, would that not really count as common knowledge?
No, I think that's a genuine concern, and it's plausibly tied to the decline of nationwide media that generate common knowledge. That is, when you're watching Walter Cronkite or even when you're watching Johnny Carson, you know that most other Americans are watching him, or many others, and they know in turn that you are and that everyone else is. When you get kind of fragmentation, when there's one huge subcommunity that watches Fox News and another that doesn't, or with social media where you link, retweet, repost within a mutually reinforcing network, which is almost disjoint from a second reinforcing network, you can get common knowledge relative to those networks without common knowledge between them. And that can also extend to understanding of basic facts of reality. Was the 2020 election stolen? And so on, where since all of us depend on, we kind of out people that we trust, to the journalists, to the scientists, the academics, the government officials. If you then fragment it so that there are different influencers, different knowledge contractors, then that can contribute to the polarization that we're now seeing, including the epistemic polarization.
Yeah, that seems a striking description of our reality now, that on one part of our political spectrum we say everybody knows that X, and then on the other part of the political spectrum people can say everybody knows that not X. And so we live in a society consumed by these rival forms of common knowledge.
I don't know if you necessarily know my politics, and I'm like you, something of a centrist, which means that different sides can kind of claim us if it's expedient. But I've sometimes fallen into these strange conversations where someone will just assume that I'm well, of course, when the election results were distorted in 2020 or before, when the Democrats were bussing in all these illegal immigrants to cast illegal votes, there's awkward moments in the conversation where the assumption is that, of course, I agree with them, and meanwhile, a look of mounting horror is coming on my face, or vice versa. With different sets of assumptions are assumed to be common knowledge.
Yeah, I was at a conference a few days after the murder of Charlie Kirk, and a reasonably senior appointee in the Biden administration said to me, oh, isn't it horrible that, I don't think it was even a question, it was just sort of assuming that I would agree, it really is horrible that we'll have to pretend to be upset that he got shot. And so, she seemed to think that in her social circle, it was common knowledge that actually we're all secretly happy that Kirk was shot, and that is the natural stance to have. And so, yes, being, people assuming that you're in on some piece of common knowledge, that actually on factual or normative grounds you very much do not partake in, is one kind of very strange form of alienating social experience.
Well, indeed, there's a phenomenon that I briefly discuss in the book. I've talked about it in other books in greater detail, of pluralistic ignorance, or a spiral of silence, where it's a case of a common misconception with private knowledge, where everyone assumes that everyone else believes something and no one actually believes it. Cases of this, I think the first academic study showed that among frat boys, every thought that drinking until you puke and pass out is cool, and no one actually believes it, and each one says, well, what can I do? I think it's stupid to get so drunk, but every other guy in the frat thinks it's cool, and no one actually does. And that is another phenomenon, not exactly of common knowledge, but of this thinking about other people's thoughts, in this particular case mistakenly. It often happens when there is fear of punishment for preference falsification. You can get Emperor's New Clothes-like common misconceptions when there isn't the little boy who can actually blurt out, and again, because of fear of punishment if you do voice the truth.
Steven Pinker, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Yascha. A real pleasure, as always.